So it's just like, okay, let's just have a real talk, no censorship.
Welcome to the Boiling Frogs Post Roundtable. We've got a lively discussion planned for you today, and we're glad that you're watching. Joining me from Japan is James Corbett, who contributes to Boiling Frogs Post with his fabulous Eye Opener video series, and of course operates at corbettreport.com. Sibel Edmonds, the publisher of Boiling Frogs Post, and of course the author of a powerful book called Classified Woman, joins us as usual. I'm Peter B. Collins in San Francisco, where I operate peterbcollins.com and contribute the Processing Distortion podcast to Boiling Frogs Post. And our special guest today is Andrew Gavin Marshall, a contributor here at Boiling Frogs Post, where he does the weekly Empire, Power, and People podcast. He also is the project manager of the People's Book Project, head of the Geopolitics Division of the Hampton Institute, and is the research director of Occupy.com's Global Power Project. Andrew, it's great to have you with us today.
Great to be with you.
We were all struck by a recent podcast that you posted at Boiling Frogs Post regarding your thoughts on anarchy, socialism, libertarianism. And I have to say that as an unreconstructed liberal, I found it all very interesting. And I have always been open to exploring alternatives to the systems that we have. And I think that there are many positive attributes of what is called anarchism. But first, I think we need to define what you mean by that. Because for many people, the broad definition of anarchism is chaos. It's every person for his or herself. And I've learned from people who call themselves anarchists that that's not really the case. So why don't we start there with you defining your perception of anarchism in today's terminology?
Well, anarchism comes from the Greek word anarchos, which means to be without authority. That is sort of the fundamental concept of anarchy, to be without authority. It's probably the political philosophy with the most variation possible and allowed. So you have anarchist groups and different sort of ideologies across the spectrum. But ultimately, I think that anarchy is about, first of all, questioning the legitimacy of all hierarchically institutionalized structures, all power structures, to question the legitimacy, and if it's not legitimate, to oppose and make that structure obsolete. And anarchist principles involve collective organization, horizontal organization, from the ground up, not to have hierarchies, not to have top-down structures, but to have bottom-up, collective, truly democratic structures as a means of organizing society. In that sense, I think that anarchy is ultimately the true definition of democracy, since it's from the bottom up instead of a top-down imposed approach to what we call democracy. But anarchism, I think, and I think fundamentally is about not only opposing authority and authority structures, but of creating a new system, a new social order from the bottom up, which makes the prevailing one obsolete. And you can have various anarchist thoughts and also actions which are representations of anarchism. So for example, when workers in a factory organize and decide to run the factory themselves, removing the perceived need for management, that's anarchism. Whether or not the workers identify that as anarchism or their beliefs as anarchism, that is an anarchistic act in and of itself. And that's kind of a fundamental principle for in what's called industrial democracy. So you can have political democracy where you hold elections and elect people. Industrial democracy never made it that far for some reason in the workplace, in the economic sphere, where we allowed tyrannies that we call corporations to dominate that spectrum. while they let us eat our cake and holding elections annually. But democracy, or rather anarchy, is to be experienced and sought in all spheres of human activity and interaction. So it's not simply in terms of thought, but in terms of actions that people take, which represents anarchy, or what we call anarchy. And you're also correct in pointing out that it has long been associated with chaos and disorder. One of the original philosophers of anarchism, Pierre Proudhon, said that anarchy is order, not chaos. And I think that that's correct. And I do believe that anarchy is order precisely because authority is chaos. We live in a world dominated by authority structures, no matter where or what structure you identify. And we live in a world of chaos, war, poverty, destruction, violence, and imperialism. That's not a world of order. That's a world of structured and destructive chaos. So anarchy is the opposite of that, both in approach and objective.
And Andrew, I wanted to do a little show and tell here, because recently for me, a window into contemporary anarchists is this book written by Scott Crow. And it depicts or recounts his activities in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, the flood, the failure of FEMA, the corporatized response to the disaster with Blackwater soldiers patrolling the streets. And there was chaos in New Orleans. And the anarchists brought their own sense of order. And as you have alluded to, it was a collective approach. They went back to Texas for extra supplies, but they operated without a hierarchy. Their focus was delivering the services that the city, the state, and the federal government failed to provide to those who were stranded after the levees broke and the floods just inundated the city. Pardon me. And so Scott Crow, to me, is a very interesting, he's also quite articulate, and I recommend to our viewers his book, Black Flags and Windmills. But to me, it really gave me a fresh look at anarchism as an appropriate response to the failure of government. And I think most people can easily identify that on the scale of New Orleans post-Katrina. But we're looking at, in terms of the United States, a government that is failing on a daily basis. And so I'm interested in alternative approaches. And I think that you, in your original podcast, articulated a very interesting continuum from socialism to libertarianism to anarchism. And each has some very valuable attributes.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reference you made to New Orleans is interesting. I didn't actually know about that at all, but it reminded me of Occupy Sandy, following Hurricane Sandy in New York. Occupy Sandy was this spontaneous collective grouping that emerged in response to the hurricane, which sought to connect people, figure out what people needed in which areas, to get those supplies and to get them out there and to transport all this stuff and to actually directly help people in need, because the aid agencies, and again, FEMA and other agencies, were incapable or unwilling, or both, doesn't matter, of actually providing what was needed at that time. And Occupy Sandy was so successful that at their debriefings of what was going on, it was attended by all the other governmental agencies, because they didn't know anything. They didn't know what was going on. They probably didn't care that much. But here you had a ground up spontaneous organization, which was just facilitated by people in the community who were interested and mobilized by the disaster to organize and facilitate what they could to help. And they were very successful at that. And I think that's just another example of that. But getting to your actual point of sort of tracing this evolution, I guess, of thought, and with socialism and libertarianism. Libertarian as a word and as a concept actually came out of anarchism in the 19th century. So there's a word or a term which is given to anarchists. It's kind of synonymous with it, which is libertarian socialist. And it may sound like a contradiction, but that's where the term originally comes from. It was only in the, I guess, the early to mid 20th century that the word libertarian became associated more with a specific economic philosophy that came out of places like the Mises Institute and elsewhere. But I'll actually sort of deflect to a quote I have here from Mikhail Bakunin, who is a major anarchist philosopher and also a major challenger of Marx in his day, which is that liberty without socialism is privilege, injustice. Socialism without liberty is slavery and brutality. So it's about understanding that liberty and socialism are not opposing concepts, but rather interconnected and interdependent concepts. For true socialism to emerge, to be relevant, it needs libertarianism to ensure liberty. For libertarianism to reach its potential, it needs socialism to lay the groundwork, that they have to operate not one and then the other, but concurrently and together, that they are mutually reinforcing concepts. And I think that's sort of a main issue, I presume, of what I was saying previously, but also just in terms of moving forward and finding ways to build bridges between activists and philosophies and people organizing today, because there are so many divisions and they often become really extreme, and this gets in the way of moving forward. But I think that this is an area where you can actually start to build bridges and understanding between different groups.
Mm-hmm. Sibel?
Both of you provided great examples, but those were like circumstantial examples and also things within a short period of time. So if we look at what you just described, and that is anarchism, what kind of example we'll be able to find that would show anarchism working in a more long-term situation rather than catastrophe? Because I agree with that. The same thing happened in Turkey with the earthquake in 1999. And one of the amazing things was, even the animosity between the Greeks and Turks, which has been, going on for a long time, disappeared. So they joined the relief efforts, and I mean, you just saw this incredible solidarity, okay? And well, of course, 6 months later, 9 months later, things went back to where they were before. Another example would be the occupation or Occupy Wall Street movement. Started with this really good, cohesive, really energized. And then what started taking place in long term was people started getting more fragmented, and the hijacking by some of the power establishment NGOs started taking place. So while we can give examples with short-term or situational, circumstantial examples, can you think of anything that would illustrate how it would work in a longer period of time in a larger context?
Well, we don't have very long examples to go by, precisely because we don't live in an anarchistic society. But there are examples historically looking at, such as the Spanish Revolution, where you did see anarchist movements develop and successfully handle the maintenance of society quite efficiently, I might add. And this also took place during the early years and even predating the Russian Revolution. In both cases, the anarchist movements were destroyed from forces within and without. In Russia, you had the Bolsheviks, who literally went out and killed a lot of the anarchists, as well as the Western-funded groups inside Russia seeking to establish a liberal state capitalist society. They were also destroying the anarchist groupings. In Spain, you had Western societies, the Soviet Union, and all of Europe's fascists collectively working and competing and fighting each other, as well as killing and destroying the anarchist revolution inside of Spain, which did show significant progress. The city of Barcelona, especially, was run entirely by anarchist collectives and in a very successful manner until, of course, Franco came around. But the fact that attempts at long-term or much larger scale anarchist projects have failed is not an indication that they can't succeed, because after all, you can make the same claim about literally anything. We don't live in an actual capitalist society, but you can it's challenging to make the claim that capitalism as a sort of at its base concept is impossible, because here we are, because this isn't necessarily a capitalist system. The same case can be made for socialism or democracy. Judging by what we have at present and saying that democracy obviously doesn't work, why bother trying to move towards democracy, is, I think, sort of a flawed approach, instead of going towards looking at what are the successes and failures of democracy, and what is democracy fundamentally, and how could you move towards that. That, I think, is more of a long-term approach. Anarchism is, like you said, you see it in these examples that are very much in the short term, and oddly enough, in reaction to catastrophes and situations of great need, which I think is kind of an indication in and of itself. But there's questions that have to be asked and answered, which we as a society, as a people, haven't spent really any time on, such as how can we utilize technology to make things like basic services and necessities being taken care of. Our society shouldn't be geared towards just employment and jobs, and that is the point of life, and you work, and then you make money, and then you die. And congratulations, that's life. Anarchism will have to find ways to address all of these necessities: food, shelter, taking care of cities, communities, cleaning. I mean, what about janitorial services? Who does that in an anarchistic society? These are questions that need to be asked and answers that need to be sought. But the only way that we can actually figure this out is if we start having the conversation, but also if we start trying through trial and error. That's ultimately how we'll figure out long-term solutions to these things. I don't think there's inside the anarchist community, there are incredible divisions along different philosophies and beliefs, and you'll have people saying that, Proudhon was right and we should only follow his ideas, and others will cite other philosophers. There's all this sort of incessant and I think irrelevant infighting. I think ultimately, if you really want to figure out which one is quote-unquote right, and I don't think there is one, it's just a matter of trying out new things and seeing what works, what adapts, and what evolves over the long term. And that's where we can see, looking at the successes and failures of other groups, other communities in the world, and we can already see some of this in different resistance movements around the world. And even in the responses to catastrophes, you see examples of what works. Why does that work in a situation like that? And why can't we sort of replicate that in times of quote-unquote peace and order? These are, I think, really important questions. I don't have the answers to them, but I think that ultimately trial and error is where we'll figure that out.
James, you want to chime in here?
Well, Sibel, I do certainly appreciate the question that you raise, and it's an important one, but I think that the answer to it is a lot easier than a lot of people might think. And I guess the straight no BS answer is to say that no one here in this conversation, no one listening to this conversation, no one on the planet is going to have the answer for how to act proscriptively in every possible situation. The creation of totalizing ideologies is I think, a type of virus that has unfortunately infected our political consciousness and much to our detriment. And let's just take the microcosmic example, because it's always easier to see in the microcosm. Andrew poses the question, who's going to clean the toilets in the anarchistic society? That's a very good question, but I think that the answer can be located in, for example, the idea of the household. There are certain households in which, the mother will clean the toilet, or the father will clean the toilet, or the kids will clean the toilet, or some combination thereof will clean the toilet. And then there are other households where I guess they probably don't clean the toilet. And in an anarchist society, you know what? All of those might be viable options when we extend that out to society and to all of the other tasks in society. The point of anarchism, I think, and I completely agree with what Andrew was articulating in his podcast, is that this is not an ideology. It is, to use the phrase that Andrew brought up, it wasn't me, everyone, so you don't have to squawk at me with your parroting popinjays of popular protest that, squawk, he used the free market word, squawk. Andrew himself said free market of ideas is what is needed, because it is not from me, it is not from you, it is not from any individual out there that we're going to come up with the answer to how to organize society. It is through the peaceful, voluntary interactions of tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, eventually billions of people on this planet that we will come to not just one answer, but many different answers in different contexts that will hold for different periods of times for different reasons. For me, the entire issue, I know people want to see some sort of penis measuring contest of people battling out their political ideologies here. That is not how I would frame this debate at all, what the conversation that we're having. I think that the remarkable thing, exactly as Andrew was saying, is that there are incredible bridge building opportunities here if we understand this issue at its fundamental level. And for people who are incredulous at that idea, I think I agree with, for example, I agree with Andrew on maybe 50 to 60% of his political and economic thought, probably 80 or 90% of his proscriptive ideas for what society needs to do, but 100% on the substantial issue. The substantial issue is not one of political ideology. It is not one of economic organization. It is an ethical construct, nothing more, nothing less. And it boils down to a very simple principle. The idea that I respect you and as an individual and your right to freely and voluntarily associate with others in the way that you want, and I expect the same respect in return. That's it. And if there is any argument against that, I have yet to hear it, or at least any argument that makes sense to me. So that's all I'm arguing, is for that simple moral principle of voluntary association. And upon that principle, we can erect any edifice of any political organization, any social compact, any economic system that you want. If you want to go off and build your zeitgeist, resource-based economy, flying Marxist robot city, awesome, go for it, have fun. If you want to make your socialist factory worker paradise, go for it. If you want to subject yourself to something calling itself government that presumes to have authority over you, you go ahead. It's perfectly in your right. Just don't expect me to go along with that, and we'll be fine. There's absolutely no debate at that point. So for me, that's all it boils down to, is the fundamental principle of voluntary association.
Very interesting. Andrew, you want to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, I think you nailed it on the head there. But the idea of to reappropriate the phrase, a free market of ideas, I think is really tapping into the most valuable resource we have as a species, which is the species. If you compare the sheer number of people in this world, which has surpassed 7 billion people, to the number of people in this world who dominate it, to the number of institutions, which I might add are hierarchically organized and structured, which dominate the ideology and actions of our society. Look at the ways in which ideas rise through institutions to the top to become dominant ideologies. This takes a great deal of time. This takes years, decades, generations. And these structures are so large, and of course, being hierarchical, they function from the top down. So to respond to changes and desires from the bottom up, which is to say to respond to democratic needs and desires, that of the people, it takes a great deal of time for the institutional structure of society to adapt. And it only does so begrudgingly. It only does so with a great deal of force and pressure. And this is what we call reform. And it takes forever for very little results comparatively. And I think that that's not a very efficient way to run society, because while we can have actual good things come through reform processes, enhanced rights for different groups of people, laws which recognize rights, civil liberties, etc. I mean, I don't think it's legitimate to necessarily say that all reform efforts are faulty or wrong. There are good things that obviously come through. But it takes so much time. And at our current trajectory as a species, where we're sort of headed for the cliff like the dodo bird, running as fast as we can towards extinction, I don't think we have the time to wait for reform to catch up to the needs of the population of Earth, not to mention the Earth itself. And I think that the resource of human potential and the creative capacity of many is something that has largely gone untapped. I mean, just the fact that 1 billion people, 1 in 7 people on this planet live in urban slums is a pretty startling statistic, let alone the fact that half of humanity lives on less than $2 a day. Again, a startling concept. These are people who essentially have to live day to day, struggling to eat and survive the day. Imagine if we had a society in which the basic necessities of life were not a daily concern, and therefore you have 3.5 billion to 7 billion people who you could tap for intellectual resources, for ideas. If you take a group of 100 people and sit them down and ask a question about, come up with ideas of how to solve this problem, chances are you're going to get a lot more interesting and creative responses and possibilities than if you sat down by yourself and said, how am I going to solve all the problems, and impose this upon other people and convince them to acknowledge that this is the one right way to do this. That's not an easy task, but 100 people in a room, 20 people in a room, even just 5 people sitting down together to solve a problem are likely to have more and better ideas, because each one of them is an individual capable of ideas, but together they're capable of so much more and capable of actually enacting these ideas. And I think the creative capacity of many will always outweigh the individual initiative of one. And I think that's sort of what you were getting at in terms of a free market of ideas and a voluntary association. And I think you nailed the head on that one.
I just wanted to offer a comment to Sibel that on May 2nd, a group of former Occupy activists are forming a new political party in the United States called the After Party. They're holding a launch event in Detroit, and their manifesto really does line up with some of the descriptions of anarchism that we're discussing here today. So I'm intrigued by what they're doing, and I see it as a positive extension of the Occupy effort from a couple of years ago. Andrew, I want to talk a little bit about terminology, because the term anarchism is poisoned in the minds of many people, just as liberalism and socialism are. And to be fair, libertarianism to some people is an off-putting term. But behind each of these labels are some excellent ideas, and if we take the negative connotations away from them, we could all benefit. There are things that we can learn. And so, for example, we've seen the last couple of years in the U.S. the right attacking Obama and claiming that he is a socialist because he has permanently corporatized the delivery of healthcare in this country. And also, we have people who abuse the term libertarian to suggest that you can be a racist rancher and not pay your grazing fees. So I'm just struck by the way the power structure demonizes terms in order to keep people away from ideas that it fears. And I think that that's one of the things I'd like to see this conversation overcome, to help the people who are watching this understand that, many of these isms are cast in a negative light because they directly threaten the oligarchs and others who are in power today.
Absolutely. The best response to this type of question is always to quote George Orwell. Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful, murder respectable, and to give a feeling of solidity to pure wind. Language is very important, not only in the understanding of power and the understanding of world and communication, but in the application of power. And political language obstructs meanings and sort of undermines understandings. And this is both in how the powerful use language, but also how they demonize and obstruct language. And I think the isms come into that in a pretty strong way. Just as the fact that anarchism is so demonized. When I first started, the first times I heard the word anarchism and met people who called themselves anarchists, I just kind of wrote them off as crazy people. I thought that, they just want a society of chaos and violence, and that doesn't sound very appealing to me. But that's because I ultimately didn't know anything about anarchism or its history or the word or the meaning. And when you actually start to look into these things, you find that these words do have a lot of meaning behind them, but that it's, I think, necessary to break these associations that we have. I've heard some people, just in conversation, suggest that the word anarchism should be abandoned altogether because it's just too tainted to refurbish. But my problem with that is that abandoning the word almost feels like abandoning the history. And there's so much in anarchist history to learn from, both failures and successes, though mostly failures, but there's so much there to look at and to learn from that I think it would be a disservice to what anarchism is to simply abandon the word because it's inconvenient. Instead, I think that it's necessary to discuss what these things actually mean, what these words actually mean, so that they can be reappropriated and they can regain their original, or even better yet, a new meaning, which is more true to the original intent. And regardless of which ism that is, I think this is something that needs to be done for all of these terms and words. And like you mentioned, the example of Obama being called a socialist, every time I heard that, I would just cringe. It was just like, okay, it would be at least a little more reassuring if the man was a socialist. But if anything, he's a corporate socialist. And if anything, as you mentioned, the healthcare system, where that was when the word was being used the most, that's the best example of his corporate socialism. And everything the man has ever done is an example of how he is not a socialist, and how he is not any of what I would call good isms. But yeah, that's a problem. And because these words are used and propagated in the media, people just accept them. And so they can call him a socialist. But if you ask these people what is socialism, then I don't think you're going to get a very coherent answer. And that's also frequently the case with anarchism. But that was also the change of the meaning of the word anarchism has been kind of a process over the course of the 20th century. And I think that initially it really began with police forces in the United States, in Argentina, across Europe, that were very concerned about anarchists, militants, and activists because anarchists were sort of at the forefront of revolutionary movements around the world at that time. And that sort of sparked the international coordination of major police forces across Europe and into the US, which was sort of unprecedented at that time. And police forces domestically and around the world began demonizing anarchists as violent extremists, bent on creating chaos. And over time, that kind of garnered a lot of attention, and eventually the two terms anarchy and chaos became just sort of merged in the collective mind of people. That has to be challenged, I think, if we're to actually have meaningful understanding and actions of anarchism in the present and future.
Mm-hmm. Sibel?
Oh, no, I mean, I do agree with the notion. What I'm having a hard time to understand is, again, I talked about the context or the period of time, but again, with some of the examples, we talked about inside a factory, okay, we have a group of workers. But when we start looking at a much larger, the masses, when all these things actually have to work interconnected, because whether it's the factory or it's the janitorial services on the street, that is the part that I'm having a hard time seeing. Because in my real life example, for example, okay, I'm going to give one example. During my university years, my graduate degree, the professor would say, okay, let's form groups, brainstorm, and here I want you to come up with this particular solutions. And a group of 5 or 7 or 8 people, we would be talking about it. There would be disagreement. But usually what happened naturally was some people wanted to have someone or some 2 people to take charge. Otherwise, we felt like we were not getting anywhere, because we do have different personalities in life. You know, we did a program, a show here about, you know, maybe we mistitled it, saying why people are so stupid. We were talking about why 90% of people are not paying attention, you know, to certain issues, or they are not becoming activists, or they are not reacting. And we kept searching for an answer for that, right? Because we said, well, what is it? Well, we are looking at society with all types of people, okay? I mean, you have people who are absolutely self-centered, but also you're looking at the dilemma of big fish, little fish, and it seems to be the gradual conclusion of everything. You know, the type A personalities, the leadership type versus, let's say, the bullies in a school that they become territorial. How do you go about sorting that when you put it in some of the context, in real life context? You know, another example of my, you know, I gave an example of the university, but let's say in a company. All these engineers, programmers would be sitting around the table for days and days and days, and they would end up fighting with each other, not being able to bring it to conclusion, you know, having something that most people or most of the group agrees with. And at that point, they would have either the CEO or the COO or the CTO come, and he would take everybody's, and then at the end, everyone was happy. Up until that point, it was a struggle. In the end, after discussing all the ideas, they wanted to have, it was as if they wanted to have the central figure to come put it together, because, well, everybody thought, you know, each person thought my idea is the best idea, you know, my way is the best way. Yet there needs to be the group decision combining maybe elements of these ideas. But even for that to take place, it ended up naturally going to this phase where they needed to have this structure. Meaning, I'm not talking about the busing. I'm going to take your ideas, saying, well, how about this? How about this compromise? Then they would be shaking heads. So what I'm trying to say is, with all the psychology of, you know, people, the different types of personality, which makes it great, because we need all kinds of people, you know. There's a role, there's a part for every kind of person. Yet it seems to be, even when you have that freedom, okay, let's do it together, collectively, bottom up, the group leads itself to the point saying, well, we brought it up to this point, now we need that implementation or the final decision making. Otherwise, it keeps getting to be divided, or the confrontations, or In some cases, people quitting in the company, and I spent like 5 years with that. This is the struggle that I'm facing when I'm looking at the issue. I mean, what would you say to that, Andrew, or James, or Peter?
Well, let's go to Andrew first. Go ahead.
Short answer, I have no idea. That's a huge question, and it's one I certainly don't know the answer to. But in your previous comment, you referenced circumstances. And in terms of referencing anarchist actions which occurred in specific circumstances, and that they were successful, but within those confined circumstances and within those situations. And I think that your example of working with these people in school, in companies, these are also their own specific circumstances. And we happen to, within the Western society, be essentially from birth raised to support, idolize, respect, and adhere to authority. So when we're put in a group of people, the first question is, who has authority? Because we don't know how to actually function collectively. That's not something that we were raised with. That's not a principle that is fundamental in our society, and it's not something that we're familiar with. So it seems scary and it seems chaotic. And certainly, to just kind of throw us into that situation, it can frequently does lead to chaotic situations like those you described. But I think if you were to say go to an indigenous community, whether in the United States, Canada, or basically anywhere across Africa, where there is a very strong collective, cooperative culture and history, and you ask them to solve a problem as a group, I think they would be far more successful than we would be in our present situation because of the cultural context and the history that these circumstances provide. So in that sense, I don't know what the answers are to figuring out how to do that. Do we have a process whereby some groups will choose to elect a leader that represents their view and find some ways to keep that power in check? What does that power constitute? These are really important questions. Would that work at all? Or can there be certain ways to organize and make decisions based upon consensus as a group? If somebody disagrees, then they simply leave the group. Like James mentioned, sort of voluntary association. You only participate in what you want to participate in, but there's still things that need to be done. Again, going back to the scrubbing of the toilets, I don't, that's kind of my job in the house here, but it's not something I really enjoy doing. And it's not something I imagine a lot of people enjoy doing. And if we simply said that only do what you want to do, that's not a job that'll get done too often. But so there needs to be some sort of sharing of responsibility. And I think a sharing of responsibility comes from collective decision making, because that is in and of itself authority. And with authority comes that kind of responsibility. So everybody has to take up extra responsibility when they get extra liberty. That's a requirement. Otherwise, you do have chaos. But ultimately, I don't know the answer to this question. I think there will be no lack of scenarios in which it does result in chaotic circumstances, but I also think that if we look to other communities and other cultures and other places around the world, you'll see very successful examples. And that's why I think in terms of Sibel, earlier you mentioned the word solidarity, and I can't believe that I forgot to mention this word in my first little rant on this, because that is the main principle of not only anarchism, but really any sort of revolutionary thought and action. Solidarity is key. But I think that solidarity has to go far beyond simply expressing solidarity with other people's struggles. It has to become something with a more solid base. And that means communicating, interacting, cooperating, working with other activists, other movements, other people around the world. So I think in terms of figuring out better ways forward and organizing from the bottom up, it's necessary to do it locally. But also, we need to expand simultaneously our interaction globally. We need to be able to learn from other examples, to interact, to go to different places and learn what they're doing and learn what their successes are and what their failures are, and bring that back to our own communities, and to bring people from elsewhere to our parts of the world, and see what we can teach them or not. And but ultimately, I think there's a certain responsibility being in Western society, being in the dominant imperial society of the world, and that's that we really have to reach out to everywhere else on the planet that we have dominated for the past 500 years, and oppressed and impoverished, because despite our near continuous domination and ruthless repression of the rest of Earth, people have managed to survive and flourish and find even small comforts and happiness in their day-to-day lives, and there's something to be learned from there, because we have materially so much, yet in terms of genuine happiness, I find that there's a lot more in poor places of the world than there are in suburban neighborhoods where I grew up. And I think that there's something to be learned from that. So in terms of finding solutions, yes, they're inside, at home, from the ground up, but they're also around the world. And that we have a certain responsibility to actually reach out and learn instead of teach necessarily.
James?
Okay.
Well, Sibel, you bring up the old refrain that I'm sure anyone who has espoused anarchist ideology or many other types of ideology has heard a million times, which is human nature. Human nature, it's human nature, human nature. Status quo is human nature. And if that is true, I mean, there's a couple of responses to this. The first, I guess you could say, if the only rubric for measurement of the success of an idea is that it has the kind of stability that we've come to expect from the status quo, then the only system that we could ever advocate is the status quo, and it would be the corporatist, fascist, globalist regime which has ensconced itself in power right now, because
democracy.
Yeah, exactly. The representative democracy that the United States so obviously is, right? Because that has persistence. It's persisted for a long period of time, and therefore is compatible with human nature. Human nature. I think the more, well, if that were true, then I guess we should all suck our thumbs and go home, because there's nothing we can do about it. But I obviously don't believe that to be true, and I think Andrew absolutely brings up the most important part of this, is that we are, all of us, so incredibly ensconced in our own cultural context and in the way that we see the world, that it is important to remember that there are other ways of seeing the world, and that the human nature is if not infinitely malleable, at least exceptionally malleable, and usually much more malleable than we would ever think. And I can speak from experience in this, living in the Japanese culture and experiencing that for myself, in which it is certainly very hierarchical, and there certainly are authorities and authority positions, and people respect that. But when it comes to decision making, it is very much a society that understands how to reach collective agreement on issues without the need for imposed authority. And if you want to see the example of that, the shining example, it's a documentary that I've recommended before. I will recommend it again. I cannot recommend it strongly enough. It's called Children Full of Life, and it's available for viewing on YouTube. And it's a documentary showing a Japanese fourth grade class and following that class throughout the year as the teacher puts the class through various activities in which the children really most often are leading the activities. They're the ones coming to their own understanding of how to proceed and how to reach agreement on various issues and how to find consensus. And in that context, I mean, it is truly an amazing thing to watch. And when you watch it, I think that gives us the idea, at least the glimmer of an idea, of what a society that's raised to actually understand themselves in that context would look like. I think that those children, if that process were followed all the way up, and unfortunately I can say that not every class here in Japan is like that, but if it were followed, and if that were the norm that was inculcated in our society, I think this idea that it's human nature, we'll all just devolve into fighting factions and we'll all hate each other and we'll all be at each other's throats, is not true. It is not true, and it doesn't have to be true. It may be true in our current political and cultural context, in the current situation, but it doesn't have to necessarily be true. And again, I think what we're advocating is not at all a radical thing. 99% of our interactions in daily life are voluntary and non-hierarchical. There doesn't have to be any hierarchical authority to tell you how to eat or what to eat or how to dress or who to marry or who to be friends with. Or perhaps one of the best examples, there doesn't have to be an authority that tells you, this is the English language and this is exactly what the way that it has to be said. There's no authority, there's no institution that decides on any of that. That comes spontaneously through interaction, and it creates a system that's itself always in flux. So I understand everyone wants the consequentialist argument. Everyone wants how will this make this society better, and just give us the answer. There is no answer. We have to let go of that idea. There are millions of answers that will come spontaneously through voluntary interaction, and I understand that it's a big leap to believe in that, and I'm not necessarily even asking people to believe in that. All I'm asking for is for them to respect the ethical principle that voluntary association should be respected. And that's it. And if we respect that basic ethical principle, then we at least have the possibility of living up to our potential as human beings, as real moral agents. If you take away our ability to voluntarily associate and to withdraw our association when we disagree with someone, then we are not moral agents. We are automatons acting around like robots in a system. And I'm not saying this will be a utopia. It will not. People will kill. People will rape. People will murder. There will be problems. There will be theft. There will be anger and rancor and destruction.
Actually, that was really good. You brought up another, you mentioned human nature as we discussed, but one of the words I've been getting a lot from people emailing me or sending notes is, you guys are, and that includes me, you are always like aiming for this utopia. And you just mentioned that word. And I want you guys to also get into this, because I sometimes feel like, this Christmas story with the island of the misfit toys, with Boiling Frogs Post is the island of these misfit actors who believe in utopia, all of you, it's just like, okay, that's why we call it irate minority, or at least I call it irate minority. I already accepted that 99% or 98% of people, they are not going to, agree with this, and that's perfectly fine with me. But you mentioned that word, and that's why I just wanted you to expand upon that, and the fact that people basically labeling a lot of things that we cover, including our foreign policy and this particular issue, Bitcoin, for example, we just covered with our eye-opener video. It's like, yeah, but it's just like you guys always aiming for this utopia, and it's sweet, but the real world doesn't work that way, and that's the word that is used. And I'm not really playing the devil's advocates, but sometimes when I'm asked questions or I ask myself questions, I get stuck. And you're right, we don't have to have answers for everything. But when, let's say, we're talking about voluntary associations or voluntary withdrawals, I mean, how does it apply to certain things? I mean, you have a city, you have a neighborhood, okay? And you all collectively decide to put a stop sign because the kids are playing here, the cars need to slow down, stop, because otherwise they're going to hit these kids. Well, should people voluntarily abide by that and say, well, I don't like the idea of stop sign, so I'm going to go through it. And what good does it do, really, for the community to put this together? And we are interconnected, but the passerbys that are coming from another community that were not part of that decision, they say, you know what, heck with your stop sign, I'm going to go through it. I don't agree with it. And there goes your kid, gets hit with the car. I mean, what do we really mean by voluntary with certain things? Do we make that, okay, we really are opposing and we're saying we will not tolerate, we don't want rape, for example. Wouldn't that be voluntarily people abide by that? You have another community or another city's passers by saying, well, that's not my law. and I'm going to do that, what would be the consequences for community voluntarily agreeing on things with some of the people not volunteering to agree with it? Well, how do you go from there? And I know, again, we said we don't have answers, but these are the types of questions come. And if we cannot put some of the things within context and real life, situation, again, I use one of those phrases, real life, then we will not even be able to carry these conversations. The other day, I was trying to explain to my husband, I said, I have mixture of the liberal ideas, the socialists mixed with some libertarians. But if I were to use a word, I would say I'm localitarian, I'm a communitarian. I totally disagree with central government completely, including Federal Reserve. I don't want this federal government, right? I like within communities, the smaller, the better, the bottom up, unities like in band, even break it down to the neighborhood, the education, health. A lot of things are based on demographics and situations. Let people get together. And so that is my belief. And he threw this question and I went, well, because I didn't have an answer. Said, well, unless, let's say, the entire world does the same thing, okay, this thing that a lot of people are calling utopia. And let's say you have that. You got rid of the central government that you hate, you despise. Fine, we got rid of it. But let's say we have country X that came and said, I want to take over Alaska because I need more oil. Okay, well, you have communities. How the whole community is going to get together and defend against something like that when, let's say, some other countries don't have that kind of what we just called utopia or the anarchism in place, and the country, your nation, the state is under attack. And if you don't have that unity, because it's a big country, okay, and that is taking place, how would you answer a problem like that? And again, we said we don't have answers. On the other hand, that's an easy way out, because we have to be prepared to say, okay, what do we do? Because we have, let's say, this great society, anarchy-based, voluntarily, but some of our neighbors, some countries, like let's say they decide to act like USA, they don't care about our sovereignty. They just come in there with their planes and tanks and their rockets and they say, we want to take over this. Well, how do we respond with a nation this vast? How do you even go through decision making? Well, we have to be able to not offer solutions, but start discussing and talking about it, because if we can, then it will be true and it will become utopia. Say, well, we don't have answer for this and this and this and this and this and this, but in general, this is the notion. I don't think that works. I think we should delve even deeper and put it within real life context.
Can I take a crack at that? Because I think you've raised a couple of interesting examples there.
Please.
And the first one, it's tangential, a tangential way of answering. But when it comes to the stop sign issue, I would suggest people go and take a look at my podcast on What About the Roads, talking about the spontaneous order that comes from actually removing all traffic signals, all traffic signs, all of the traffic rules and regulations that currently exist. People think it's going to be anarchy, by which they mean chaos. And in fact, in the municipalities that they've tried it in, and you can go and actually watch and look at the examples, it actually improved the conditions on the road immeasurably, because people are not suicidal, they are not insane, they do not want to kill other people, generally speaking. They just want to get from A to B, and they will actually start to act like human beings and allow others to pass. That's the kind of trivial, tangential way of answering that. On the bigger issue of something like country X or outside force X coming to invade the anarchistic community Y because they want the oil or whatever it is, I try to think of that in a real world scenario. And for example, I'm here in Japan, so I'm imagining if suddenly a bunch of Russians came and tried to occupy this town that I'm living in because they want whatever the gene factories in my area of Japan. I can't imagine that situation playing out in a way that the people here would not be opposed to that naturally and would not participate in the whatever needs to be done, the rebuttal, the the getting rid of that outside invasionary force. And I suppose there might be people here who would say, you know, whatever, I'm pacifist, so I'm not going to oppose anyone, and they can do anything they want to me and my family. I guess there might be those people around, but I would say that, you know, the vast majority would be on board with that. And I think it's precisely in those times of crisis, when there really is a genuine crisis that genuinely threatens the community on a fundamental level, I think that's exactly when petty differences between people that generally keep consensus from happening evaporate. That's precisely the moment at which people can come together and say, look, there is a clear, immediate, present threat that we can see that is right here. Let's organize and get rid of it. And I think that's exactly when you would get that type of consensus that
But by then it will be too late. Shouldn't you be preparing for that? You know, I'm not talking about the Department of Offense we have here, but if you haven't prepared all along before this disaster strikes and have put together in place the, you know, anti-missile stuff in place, et cetera, then it's too late. You can, I mean, the tanks and or whatever, the planes are there, they're taking over, they're parachuting down there, maybe by then they are robots, and then at that point, we're going to get together and say, grab the kitchen knives and go there. I mean, that's not going to happen. And if we are looking for this prep period, I mean, aren't we, again, slowly, you know, this thing that Jefferson said, and I know Andrew addressed that, you know, the original founding fathers. And again, that alone itself was also highly class-based. But one of the things that Jefferson said, saying, there are a lot of problems with what we have put. It's not perfect. It's as close as we could come at this point, but it needs to change, meaning he meant anarchy. I mean, he was an incredible anarchist, Jefferson. He said, you need to turn this upside down and start all over again, all the time, because no matter what we put in place in terms of solution and guidelines or whatever the consensus that they had, yes, they were the slave owners back then, but it's going to be temporary, and it's going to corrupt itself. It's going to rot. That's why you need to throw it and start all over again. You can't put this place concrete, whether it's the Constitution or these laws.
Sure. Well, first of all, I take a little problem with Jefferson being referred to as an anarchist, but I'll leave that for another discussion. I think I totally agree that the idea of some outside militaristic power, the United States, excuse me, coming in to destroy communities, doing this is a very real potential threat. After all, that is essentially the history of anarchist movements, is being destroyed by capitalist, communist, so-called communist, and fascist states. That's one reason why I think that for anarchism to be actually realized and successful, it is a process rather than an ideology. It is a process that has to be undertaken globally simultaneously. In other words, the notion that there is a powerful neighboring state is anathema to a successful anarchist society, because anarchist societies would not be confined within state structures, because they reject the notion of a state structure. And when you get to very powerful military states, the actual military apparatus is something that needs to be addressed very quickly, I might add. You know, in terms of the United States, I don't think there's many actual physical occupations that are required, except perhaps for the Pentagon, you know, and similar institutions like this. Like, these are the military aspect of the state is something that has to be dismantled, and has to be dismantled very quickly, and that has to be a priority of any attempts at creating an anarchistic society, because that very institution itself is not only a big threat, but it's contradictory to an anarchistic society, and it will, and I completely agree with you, it will destroy it by any means necessary. And that's something that people have to keep in mind. If it comes to an anarchistic society being invaded by an outside power, there's really only so much that that society can do. Like you mentioned, Sibel, it's, what are they going to do? Go with kitchen knives to fight F-16 fighter jets? It's not very realistic. Um, and I mean, one doesn't really need to look much further than the occupied territories to really get an understanding of that kind of situation and what it results in. And there you have, a large open air prison and horrific repression. And the world is essentially sitting and watching this happen. And unless the world, and I guess more specifically, I should say, the Western world, the industrialized, powerful world, unless we actually go through a change in not only understanding, but values, these situations can't be addressed realistically. You mentioned rape. What if somebody comes by and says, that doesn't, saying no rape is not for me. I like to rape. Imagine if, somebody comes by and says that. Well, how do people deal with that? Ultimately, I think that for an anarchistic society to be constructed, for the circumstances, first of all, to exist, which would prompt people to develop an anarchistic society, and for the slow construction of that society, I don't think that the idea of rape would be held legitimate by anyone, precisely because it would require a type of change or transformation in the culture and in people's psychology. And in how they interact with people. Because after all, if you look at the actual concept of rape, it's not about sex, it's about power. And it's about one person overtaking someone else by exerting their power over them in a particularly ruthless and violent way. That's the basis of a great deal of violence in this world. And rape is one very specific manifestation of that. But it's a power struggle. And that's where its roots are. It's in this problem, this issue of power that we don't know how to address in our society. And I think that if you look at, there was a radical psychologist named Rollo May, and he articulated an understanding, a psychological understanding of power, whereby he said that there are two things in this world which create major psychological issues related to power. One is too much power concentrated. So people who have too much authority and power, that leads to devastating consequences for people, which I'm sure we can all agree with. The other is too little power on the part of other people. So it leads to desperate reactions, responses. So again, you look at Israel-Palestine, too much power on the part of Israel in the state. You look how that results. Too little power on the part of the Palestinian people who are dispossessed. Look at how reactions take place when you saw, suicide bombings. These are reactions of the desperate. These are not solutions to their problems. They're reactions to the situation, and that's about disempowerment. An anarchistic society is about equality of power. So it would fundamentally, I think, reduce these problems by essentially socializing power and with that responsibility. And that would completely change the culture and how people interact. And so I think that is, while not an answer or solution in terms of the specific question of how would these people react in this circumstance, I think that these circumstances would be questionable if we were to actually have an anarchistic society. If tomorrow suddenly anarchistic societies were to be, forgive the contradiction, but imposed upon all of Western society, I do agree with you that it would be chaos and it would not work. These things have to develop over time, and they certainly take their time. And I think that the circumstances are fundamentally what will change this. And in the Western world, our circumstances, as you all know, and I'm sure most of the listeners know, are rapidly changing. We're undergoing deindustrialization, mass impoverishment, which we call austerity, the construction of high-tech police states. These are very concerning trends that we are running forward with as fast as we possibly can, not to mention rapidly accelerating environmental degradation. These are all major issues. But as the effects of these trends continue to hit home, and they're starting slowly, but they accumulate over time, circumstances have a way of changing people. And just like you mentioned in terms of the catastrophe being the circumstance in which these things work best, well, when our society is in essentially a permanent state of catastrophe, that's a circumstance in which you can see the beginnings of something possibly develop in a more organized, functional basis, and when the culture itself and the psychology of people will change. Alternatively, you also have the major problems that come with this. If you look at Greece, you have the development of really strong anarchist movements and other social movements coming out of Greece, but then you also have fascism. And that's because in these circumstances, fascists rise really quickly because they provide simple answers to complex questions, and because they take power, they usurp power. And they say, we'll get you food, we'll get you employment. And for a lot of people who, I remember reading interviews of people in Greece who identified historically as socialists, but when the Golden Dawn came to their house and said, here's some food for your starving family, they said, I never thought I would be voting for a fascist party, but here I am because they're actually helping me. Circumstances can change that.
Exactly. The stability of the status quo is what those types of groups offer very well. And
Exactly.
The radical solution is obviously much more difficult sell. I hate to be the party pooper, but I'm coming up against another interview that I'll have to conduct in a few minutes. And we seem to have lost Peter, who has seemed to have dropped from this conversation for some technical reason or other, or maybe he just got so offended he had to hang up. But let's just close up with some closing comments. There's no possible way to summarize or close a conversation like this, and there's much more that needs to be said about this on all these different fronts. On my own front, I guess I will just say that perhaps there's a different way of approaching these questions, because obviously, I truly understand that everyone wants the how. How will this work? How will we do that? How will that happen? It's a very important question to think about because, again, that will be the primary bone of contention. That will be the primary thing that people think and talk about in an anarchistic society. But I think perhaps more to the point of what I want to stress, which is, again, the ethical dilemma here, which is, what should happen if I don't agree with you? So, for example, in the example of the invasion scenario, I agree. Yeah, we do have to be prepared for some sort of, a threat of various sorts. And again, in the example of whatever, the Russians coming to occupy my town, again, it's a very real threat. It's imminent. I understand it. I agree that this needs to stop. So I will work together with other people to make it stop. But I also agree that we need to be prepared for that. So we need to associate in some way to prepare against threats. But if someone wants to convince me that I should be afraid of Iran and therefore I need to give a portion of my money every single month to some structure, governmental institution, whatever, in order to build big anti-missile defenses to protect me from Iran, if I don't agree with that, I fundamentally don't agree with that, what should happen to me? And in the society that we're in, I will be thrown in a cage and basically left there to rot if I refuse to pay my tribute to the government that wants to protect me from these threats, which are not threats. So again, it comes back fundamentally for me to the ethical principles involved. And that's where I continue to go back to, because it is not a consequentialist argument for me. I do believe that the world would be structured and would actually have a more reasonable structure in anarchism than otherwise, but that again is not the basis of my argument. My argument is what should happen to those who do not wish to go along with this system, and that's where I continue to bring it back to. I'll stop there. Sibel.
I know we lightly mentioned the word of human nature. I believe we need to have this as part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, because I with like many things, I don't like to approach it from either philosophical angle or from the sociological angle, because they are all so connected. So there's a psychological element in there, sociological, anthropological, and if we disregard or like we do with econ classes, you hold this constant, you hold B constant, all these variables are constant, so you're only dealing with two variables, and most of the time life doesn't work that way. So it is important to approach some of these questions, some of these aspects that we just discussed today in under all four umbrellas, and that is, human nature, all human nature, because even with that we can have hours and hours of discussion. Or what Andrew just mentioned about, okay, rape being all about power. Well, that's a hypothesis or a theory, okay, and that's one of the school of psychologists. I got a degree in psychology, and all I got was lots of confusion at the end. But I think it is very, very highly, highly, highly important. I can't emphasize it enough to continue this discussion and put it, under different aspects of, besides philosophical, political, anthropological, and then have some kind of a more holistic whole approach to it. And I truly enjoyed it. And your podcast, Andrew, was really thought-provoking. I just could tell by all the emails that were pouring in. And one of the greatest things that it accomplished was, and that includes even myself, because when I listened to it, it's like, you are right, that the term anarchy has been, and I think part of it is absolutely intentional. I remember growing up in Turkey, the military regime in the 80s kept saying, if we don't support us, you'll be back to that anarchy period where the bombs were blowing off and the mini buses. And that is one of the words that the Turks in Turkey are most afraid of. Oh no, don't give us anarchy, because to them anarchy is violence and terrorism and people coming and mugging their houses, etc., etc. And the authorities use that big time, and the fact that you don't support us, you'll be back in anarchy and you'll see what's going to happen to you. So that was one of the main things that it brought about, your podcast. A lot of people with that misconception, generalization about anarchy. So I hope we'll continue this topic, and again with Peter back as well, and Guillermo, and take it further.
Andrew?
A scientist who studies mice and experiments with mice thinks that he's understanding the effects of his experiments on a mouse. But what he's understanding is the effects of experiments on a mouse that's been kept in a cage, locked in a dark room, going crazy by itself. That's not the nature of the mouse. That's the nature of a mouse locked in a cage and made crazy. Humans are kept in our social cages. Our institutions define our society. Our ideologies define the institutions, how we interact, how we relate. This is how we define what we call human nature. I think the process and the result of breaking down the walls, breaking down the maze that the mouse is running through, will allow us to actually discover what human nature is. And I think the process of doing that, the result of doing that, that is what I call anarchism.
Well said. Well, that could perhaps be the launching point for the next conversation, because as you say, I think we will have to have many more on this. And since our host is not here to lead us out, I guess that will be my job. Of course, once again, I hope that people will check out the individual websites of the people involved. Of course, Peter B. Collins at peterbcollins.com, Andrew Gavin Marshall at andrewgavinmarshall.com. Am I correct in that?
Yep.
Yes, okay. And the People's Book Project.com.
Yes.
Okay. I always have to check. And of course, Sibel Edmonds at boilingfrogspost.com. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com. Thank you for joining us. And as always, add your voice to this mix in the comment section of the YouTube and or Boiling Frogs Post comment sections. Looking forward to your feedback and looking forward to round 2. Until then, thanks for listening.
.com.
Into a big girl again, but I'm afraid I'll turn myself back into a baby. I'm gonna teach you how to eat at the table.